Hello, it's Social Enterprise Online Festival here. Heidi, and I've got today my special guest is Melanie Bryan, who's an award-winning social entrepreneur, and I'm going to hand over to her for her to tell you a little bit more about her experience and background now. So,
hello,
welcome.
Thank you. Hello, Heidi. Lovely to see you again, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. As you say, my name's Melanie Bryan. I used to work in the big corporate world, so I was a management consultant working all over the world with household name organisations, and then I saw the light. And back in 2009, I accidentally set my own business up, and that's a long story, so we won't tell that one here. Since then, I've helped over 2,000 organisations to grow their ventures, and that's through a combination of helping them to win contracts, through particularly public sector contracts, to get funding. For example, the other week we just heard that, yes, another one of my organisations has just won £360,000 of funding, which is fantastic news, which will set them up for the next 3 years, and also growth mentoring. And along the way, I picked up 1 or 2 awards, including, I'm very, very proud of my OBE for services to social enterprise and women's enterprise.
Definitely something to be proud of, yes.
Yeah, it was a huge shock, absolutely wonderful, and I feel an obligation to live up to it every single day.
So that means as women entrepreneurs, we get the best of you now then, every day.
You certainly do, and social entrepreneurs as well, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Right, so Melanie's here today to talk to us about how to win public sector contracts and how to write winning funding bids. So my first question to you is, how would we go about winning a public sector contract? Particularly if you're a small organisation or a startup organisation, are there opportunities to win public sector contracts, or is it just for large organisations?
Do you know, it's one of those lovely misconceptions, and I love doing my myth busting about this point in time. It's really interesting. The last time that the government actually collated the statistics, 59% of all government contracts, local authority, public sector, were actually won by small and medium organisations, not by the big players. And of
that's
those,
fantastic opportunities then. So really there are lots of opportunities if you know what you're doing or where to find the contracts. And is it about who you know in order to get the information about the contracts, or is it more a case of you can find those opportunities and bid for them even if you don't know any of the people that are potentially going to be looking at that contract?
Well, one of the things that I really love about public sector is that it's very transparent and fair. It's a level playing field. So it's not who you know, it's what you know and how you're able to showcase what you do. So in terms of finding contracts, there are 2 main ways in which you would do that. The first one would be to get yourself registered on the electronic portals where they tell you about the contracts that are coming up. In your local region, if you actually just go on to any public sector site, so for example, if you wanted to look at your local authority, go onto your local authority site, find the section that says working with us or business, and in there somewhere it will give you the link to the correct portal, and all you do is register on it, click the box to make sure you get the email notifications so that the system tells you when there's something on it, and then you can go from there. They're actually obligated to publish every contract over £10,000. So you can always find it. If you want to look at the government departments, then it's Contract Finder, and there are different ones for the NHS and for the emergency services. But all the ones over £10,000 will be on there. And then depending on your local area, they'll either, the ones under £10,000 will either be on the actual local authority's website, or some of them now have set up sites like Find It In. In fact, you've got one in Birmingham, Find It in Birmingham. Yeah, there's one in my area, which is Find It in Cheshire and Warrington. So quite a lot of them are putting the under 10,000 ones on those as well. So it's definitely not who you know, it's actually just about making sure that you're looking at the right places at the right time.
Okay, and in terms of then, once I found a contract that I'm interested in, let's say you know, how would you recommend that I actually am successful in winning that contract? What are your recommendations for approaching writing a good tender, I suppose?
It's a really interesting question, and I think one of the first things to do is to be realistic, and that's on a number of levels. Writing the documentation that you need to complete for a public sector tender does take time, and we'd all wish it didn't, and it has been simplified and it's a lot better than it used to be, but it's still going to take you a lot of time. So it's really, really important that you don't leave it to the last minute and you give yourself plenty of time. The second thing is make sure you read it properly. I know it sounds really silly, but there's a lot of information that they're going to give you, and lots of people don't read it correctly, and then they just don't win it because they missed out something important, like not signing a document or not sending back everything that they'd asked for. So that's massively important. And then for me, it's about thinking about, do I need anybody else to help me with this? And this is one of the great bits for me, is sometimes you're going to be better working with another organisation and working together on the contract. And that's particularly true. You mentioned before, if you're a brand new organisation, one of the things that brand new organisations struggle with is showing a track record. So one of the quickest ways to actually win a public sector contract as a brand new organisation is to join forces with somebody who's been going a little bit longer and has got a track record, which will help you then to get onto that playing field and to earn that track record. So that's really important too. And the other bit about the help is, particularly if this is the first time you've done it, you probably need some help from someone like me who's actually done it before, who can talk you through it and help you to understand what you actually need to write and what the questions mean. And the last thing, it's the obvious thing, but it's the thing that nobody actually thinks about. Why should they actually buy you? What makes you different from everybody else? And it's about, they can only judge you by what you actually write on that page, in that answer. They can't judge you on anything that they know about you because they're not allowed to. So it's only literally what you write on there. So it's also about showing the evidence. It's what I call the so what. So people say, oh, we're a really experienced expert company at XYZ. And I go, so what? If you tried it a different way, for the last 5 years, we've supported over 2,000 service users to achieve outcomes of, that's expert and experienced.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of being a social enterprise, does that have any added value in terms of a contract, or is that something now that most businesses are able to put corporate social responsibility bits into their tenders as well, so it's more or less a level playing field with other small businesses, rather than social enterprises standing out as being providing extra added value?
I always think that social enterprises provide extra added value. I think it's about being really careful that we're able to showcase that all the way through. So there are lots of elements. One is that public sector now has to evidence that it is taking into account social value through its procurement process. So there will usually be a question in there that says, what social value can you add if you won this contract? Now, sometimes, and it's a new trend, I've seen it a few times recently, the public sector organisation is saying whatever you put in there will now make part of your contract if you win it. So I think what's interesting for me is that whatever you say in there, you do have to be able to deliver. And that's where social enterprises really stand out. We know what social value actually is, and we can think about it in the wider sense, probably more so than a socially responsible organisation looking at sort of regurgitating some of its corporate social responsibility. And we've got more flexibility. You know, we can think of different things. So, for example, offering work experience to someone who's actually quite a long way normally from the workplace. You know, offering opportunities to people who wouldn't normally get them. My husband has a social enterprise and he created the first apprenticeship for a learning disabled person. You can imagine how well that goes down in contracts when you're writing your tender. I think also it's weaving it all the way through. So one thing that social enterprises should be really good at is measuring their impact. So in terms of providing evidence, we should be much better at knowing how many people we've supported or whatever it is that we do and what the outcomes of that have been. So we're used to gathering that information, whereas lots of corporates aren't. So for me, I think it's about how we show it. And there are other elements, you know, in some of the questions, my social enterprises and charities, we say things like, we are a charity or a social enterprise. That means that we exist for this purpose and this purpose only. Our aim is not to make a profit, but actually to actually achieve our social objectives, and go on to explain where that is in the appropriate question. So well, I think these days it's how you play it to your advantage. As I said before, it's a level playing field, and there's no reason why a very switched on and groovy corporate can't actually put a really great answer to a social value question. I just think we have that little bit of an upper edge if we're clever about it.
Definitely. So one of the things when I used to do bid writing and tenders was always that they wanted loads and loads of attachments of documents. Is that still the case nowadays, that they want every single policy under the sun attached to the tender, or can you get away with just ticking boxes to say that you have those policies in place?
Well, since they changed it, we have the new supplier assessment questionnaire. It's a case of ticking boxes now. And as you can imagine, they used to get so much paper that they didn't know what to do with it. So now they only ask the winning organisation to actually produce those. So effectively, when you're going through the process of responding, you're just ticking boxes to say, yes, I've got a health and safety policy, or yes, I've got that insurance. However, if you win, you will be asked to produce it, so make sure you actually do have it. And there will always be some that they may ask for depending on the contract. So if you're working with children, it's not unusual for them to actually ask you even now to still attach your safeguarding policy, just because it is so important for that kind of work. But in general, you're ticking boxes these days.
Which is a lot better. In terms of your bid writing and tender success, what's the most unusual in terms of success or unexpected success that you've had, or are they all pretty much the same? That's probably a tough question on the spot.
Well, it is a tough question. It's a tough question because I've actually helped organisations win over £168 million of contracts and philanthropic funding in the last 7 years. So I've quite a lot to go at.
Yeah.
I think it's not necessarily about the unusual. I've helped everybody from psychologists to gardeners to win contracts, and pretty much everything you can think of in between. So in the last week alone, I helped a charity who provides services around mental health. I helped an organisation that does forensic psychology, would you believe, and one that does domiciliary care, and one that does videography. So it was a real mixture. I think that some of the ones that really kind of I like best are the ones where it's a small organisation that didn't think that this was a route for them to grow their social enterprise and then finds it isn't. So one of my psychologists is a community interest company, and she's done exceptionally well. We've gone for small contracts, grown it bigger and bigger and bigger, and in the last couple of weeks, she's won a major contract, which is absolutely fantastic, against national players. And she's a little tiny community interest company based in Manchester, and she's won against national players. And it's like, that brings me a lot of joy, because it just shows, you know, when people say small ones can't win, well, all I'm going to say is look at her. She did. And I think also, on some of the other ones, it's on the funding side rather than the contracts. I've just helped a small disability organisation. They've previously not had more funding than £30,000 a year. That would be their maximum in a year. We've just won 360,000, 200,000 from one and 160,000 from the other. And that's going to secure their future for at least 3 to 5 years, and allow them also to put in place the income diversification, you know. And that one was just like, wow.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow. And one of the things that was great about that, which is very close to your heart, is that the funders commented that one of the reasons why it was easy to give them the money was because they measure their impact.
Yay! I like that when organisations actually measure their impact. I find a lot of organisations just assume they're making a difference because they're doing something good. So if you've got the evidence, obviously it will help with contracts and tenders. One of the things which I always found when I was working with in a charity was that getting paid for delivering on contracts was always quite painful. So it always, there was a lot of cash flow management, and it could be 5 or 6 months before you saw the payment. Is that typically still the case, or can you get some money up front nowadays, or is it always a fight to get paid when you're delivering public sector contracts?
Well, the good news is it's not a fight to get paid, that's for sure.
It just feels like it.
I think it definitely used to. I remember as well what it used to be like. However, things have changed. One of the things that the successive governments have done is that they see public sector is one of the ways that they recognise is a great opportunity for small businesses to actually grow. And so to try and help them, one of the things that was brought in was that public sector now has to pay you within 30 days of receiving an accurate invoice. Yeah. So make sure you're accurate. So actually, a lot of that cash flow has disappeared, because now you're only looking at 30 to 60 days typically, because you're getting paid within 30 days, but it may take you a while to put your invoice in, etc. But that's helped a great deal. You can't generally get money up front. That just doesn't happen. They're always paying in arrears. So unfortunately, I can't see that one changing particularly. But what I have seen quite a lot of as well is you're actually getting paid earlier than that too. So although it says 30 days, I've got paid within 14 days recently on contracts, which is good, because I've declared myself as being small up front and asked them. But I think there's also things you can do to help that. So one of the things I tell everybody to do when they actually win is to get themselves in to see whoever the contract manager is in that public sector body, and sort out things like, who do I send my invoice to? What do you need on my invoice to pay me? Do I need a purchase order? Can we get it set up now? So that I have that. And I think it's those usual housekeeping issues. If you get those right up front, then it's easier for you to get paid. It's no good getting to the end of your first month and going, oh, I haven't got a purchase order on, because that is going to hold you up at that point. So yeah, you'll definitely get paid within 30 days of getting an accurate invoice, accurate meaning including whatever details they need. But sadly, no, you're not going to get paid up front.
Well, it's worth asking. You never know.
Some enlightened commissioner might decide to do it at some point.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the other things is around, once you've won the contract, what kind of things will they be expecting of you in terms of monitoring and evaluation? Is it likely to be quite light touch, or are they going to want quite a lot of information from you, perhaps on a monthly or quarterly basis?
It's supposed to be more, I can't say that word, proportionate to the contract. So effectively, they should only be asking you for things that they actually need. Usually these days, you'll find that within the specification that you receive when you start to bid for the contract, it sets out what they're going to be looking for. Okay. Typically, they're looking for things monthly, but that for us, social enterprises, should not be a problem, because we're collecting that information anyway. We collect our outputs and our outcomes on a regular basis. And they're not likely to be asking you for anything that you're not already creating and collecting for yourself. So I think a couple of things that I always make sure I do is, one is read the specification, make sure that you know what they're going to be asking you for. Make sure that you factor in that you're going to need to go and see them probably once a month to start off with. Often once they're happy with you receiving your report, they'll move you to once a quarter, but initially it's pretty much always going to be once a month. And the second thing is, set up your systems. If you need to make changes, make it straight away. And the third thing for me is, when you go in to see them for the first time, take an example of what you can give them that works for you, in a format that works for you. They're human, and a lot of the time they'll accept what you've got, provided it has everything on it that they need, so you don't actually need to set anything up that's different. So I did that recently with one of the organisations. Their commissioner is very keen on getting a lot of information on outcomes. So we pointed out to him that very gently that perhaps he wasn't collecting the right information. We showed him an example of what we're already producing, my client already produces, and he went, "Oh, that's better than I was thinking of."
Yeah, because quite a lot of people always say they've won a contract and now they've got a lot of different forms that are different to the data that they already collect, or it's in a different format. So they spend a lot of time administering the fact that they've won a contract rather than doing the delivery, which is not what they expected. So that's a really good tip in terms of going in and saying, look, this is how we collect the data, this is the format it comes in, because you could save yourself loads and loads of time filling in extra reports and additional information for commissioners.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've got a client who actually has it on a web-based system on Dropbox, and all they actually do is they provided the commissioner with a link to actually go into that folder and download it from there. So they don't even send it to him, they just put it in there. But I think it's about offering those options. Public sector are not going to turn around to you and say, what about if we put it in a Dropbox folder? Because they won't think about it. You know, they'll typically say, I want it on a spreadsheet. Well, you probably already do it on something similar, but actually it's the information that they want. So a lot of the time you can guide them as long as you're careful. Control, be helpful.
Yes, definitely. So any tips for actually writing the tenders? So as you obviously said, if you've never done it before, get some help from somebody like you. Are there any other ways? Is it a good idea to write it yourself and then get someone to check it, or would you say get someone in and get some advice before you even start writing it?
I think there are a couple of things. The first thing is, it's helpful to have somebody who understands the process and the types of questions that they ask to help you to understand what they're looking for in a question. So, for example, if they say that they want a method statement, they're looking for a detailed walkthrough of how you do it. Now, a method statement means different things to different people, you know, depending on what you do. So it's really helpful to get somebody to say, yeah, well, what they're looking for in there is, you know, for example, if they ask you about your staff, then they're almost inevitably looking for you to tell them that you vet your staff to government baseline vetting standards. Now, most of you sitting on watching this will be thinking, what on earth's that? But actually, it's a form of words, a shorthand to say that you check their photographic identity, they have a legal right to work in the UK, they are who they say they are, their references and qualifications. So it's all the stuff that you'll be doing, it's just you wouldn't know necessarily that that's what the question was asking for. So I think that really helps. Investing in that sort of a couple of hours of support early on to understand it is really, really helpful. In terms of writing it, I think you need to write it. And the reason why I think you need to write it is you are the only person who knows your organisation inside out. Nobody else does. But then get someone like me to work with you to strengthen that answer. So somebody like me would look at what you wrote and said, that's great. I can get it down into a shorter word count. There's just a knack about writing within word counts. They will ask you to write within usually 500, 300 words, sometimes 750 or 1,000. There's a knack to getting it down to that. It's just a writing style. You don't need to be an expert in writing, you just need someone who can do that for you. But in terms of when I'm looking at my clients, I'm looking at, have they answered the question? So is it somebody who's objective? Have they answered the question? Do I understand what they're saying? Do I think that their win themes, the things that make them different and why I should buy them, come bouncing through? Is there lots of evidence in there, or am I left thinking, so what? And because that then becomes a bit of an iterative process, you need that person on board from the beginning so that effectively you're doing it. Now, if you're great at getting your answer down, it's not necessarily a big investment. You know, if people think, oh, it's going to take hours, but no, not generally. In the beginning, it may do because it's your first attempt, especially if you're not used to writing things. But if you're used to writing funding bids, you're probably going to be pretty good at writing contracts, tenders for contracts. But as you get better at it, it'll take even less time, not least of which, because you'll then have some great standard answers that you can use because the same questions tend to repeat.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah. They are quite repetitive, I've found, once you get used to them.
They're very repetitive, and if you do one particular thing, you'll find the same questions come up. There might be variations on a theme, but it'll be the same things over and over again. If you work with children or vulnerable adults, you're always going to get a question about safeguarding.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a given. It's a given. Yeah.
Okay, so that's really helpful. That's answered quite a lot of information around tendering for contracts. What about grants and funding? Nowadays, I tend to say to organisations, only go for grants and funding if it fits exactly with what your purpose is and what you do, rather than trying to build and grow your organisation or your sustainability based on having lots of various projects and funding. Because the real way to sustainability for me is through trading and contracts and those kind of things. So I tend to not be negative about funding, but view it in that it's just a tiny bit of the full picture. But obviously some organisations are still dependent on funding. What are your views around that?
Let's see the same hymn shit here, sister. You know, I completely agree. I think that funding has an important role in a social enterprise. It lets you test something, often with a little bit of seed funding. It lets you test something to see if it works or not. Sometimes it will provide you with the support to let you put in place the infrastructure to scale something up. What it should never be, to me, is a permanent source of income. It's for a specific purpose for a specific time. What always worries me is when I see organisations that are just chasing the next bit of funding, because I sit there and think, you're a social enterprise. The word is enterprise as well as social. We need to do both. And as you rightly say, trading is your way to sustainability. Otherwise, all you find yourself doing is this, because you're twisting and turning what you do to fit the next funding pot. But not only that, but you don't actually ever get any stability in your organisation, because almost inevitably the people that are working for you are dependent on a particular piece of funding. So they might be there for 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is, and they're then not being, not helping you to grow in the way in which they'd love to help you to grow, and they're bound to be looking for their next job. Who wouldn't be? So you don't build the systems that you need, you don't build the processes that you need. So I'm 100% with you. I think you've got to stay really true to your purpose. Very much so. Look for funders that support that purpose and think about it strategically. So I mentioned the disability organisation that I work with. So if we sort of follow their journey, they looked at small funding like Awards for All, and a little bit from their health authority and a little bit from their local authority to help them to run some workshops. That then gave them the evidence to show that this actually produces outcomes for people with learning disabilities that can't be gained in some of the other ways. It also then, so then we applied for a little bit more. We got a little bit from the Arts Council and a little bit more from Awards for All, which let us put in accredited qualifications. Learning disabled people can get dance leader qualifications. Now we've got the next piece of the jigsaw. In the meantime, they carried on delivering their workshops. Now we're ready to scale up. So how do we take it to other areas of the country? Well, we'll be looking at some form of social franchise. And because we're looking at that, and funders can see the sustainability element of it, then all of a sudden we've been able to attract some big funding, hence the 360,000. They've got a track record. They've shown they've used their grant money wisely. They've shown that they've moved on. It's been a journey. They've got income streams coming alongside this now as well. And they can show where their income streams will come from down the line. So I think, and then my dream for them is then, other than getting funding to help them to do wonderful things like they did, they've just been to the Edinburgh Festival, do you believe, and performed at the Edinburgh Festival, which is a one-off, and things like that for performances. They should be completely self-sustainable. So the only time then they would look for funding is if they wanted to try something new.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think that's it. And there's another example, because and one that you may well know is my husband's social enterprise has never had a penny in funding, ever. He's traded since day one, and 100% of their income has always been from trading, which means that he's never ever had to do things like produce reports for funders that takes his time away from delivering. So I think there's lots of examples out there. I'm like you, I worry if an organisation is too dependent on funding.
Definitely. So one of the things I keep hearing from in the sector is there isn't any funding available. With all the budget cuts, there's no funding. Yeah, I keep seeing lots of funding. Is it really as bad as people are saying, or are they just kind of misdirected in terms of their views around funding? Because all the charitable trusts and foundations are still there, and a lot of them give to social enterprises. So are we being sold a myth in that there's no funding or there's less funding available.
I think it's a big myth because I keep on winning it for people. So absolutely. I think that perhaps where people are getting a little bit confused is that a number of years ago, one of those funding sources, grants, would potentially have come from local authorities. And I think it's very true to say that has now disappeared, but it's not actually disappeared, it's changed. So now they've made a lot of that into contracts. So you're bidding for a contract instead of actually applying for a grant. So it's not that that's disappeared and that local authorities are not still supporting social enterprise, because that's absolutely not true. In fact, we're in a much better position because they love us, because we trade and we can show evidence of track record. So actually we do great on that, I think. But to me, all the funders are still there. All the stuff that used to be there is still there. We've still got the usual ones, the awards for the lottery funded stuff. So basically awards for all and reaching communities. We've got the ones like Henry Smith and the Tudor Trust. We've got the Arts Councils. We've got the Sports England Federation. We've got all the ones that we had previously. What I do think is interesting, and I think where we all need to be quite careful, but again, I think we're in the best place, is funders are getting much more focused on evidence of need and evidence of outcomes delivered. So I think where some people are saying they think it's drying up, it's not drying up, it's just that they perhaps haven't thought through consulting service users, getting evidence of need from different sources, whether that's statistics or consultations with service users, and haven't captured the outputs and the outcomes that they've delivered.
So really when people are saying there's less funding, what they're perhaps referring to is that they need to have a stronger application and to have more evidence to support what they're actually planning to do. So is it just a case of looking for statistics of need, or how much of a balance is there between consulting service users and just taking a load of statistics off perhaps a government website?
I personally, my experience has been that I think funders are much more impressed by consultations with service users, because even if you've got the statistics, so if we stick with my disability organisation, I'm only using them because I've literally have that was fresh in my memory.
That's fine.
It's a good example because it's a great example. So they could very easily just have gone to the disability statistics, which would show that learning disabled people are less active, less likely to be engaged in sports and physical activities, etc., 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 more likely to be socially isolated. There's lots of reports like that. However, that's great, but what's much more powerful is what they did. They went out into the learning disabled community and they had questionnaires and they did focus groups and they asked people with learning disabilities and they asked their carers and their families. So what they were able to evidence was not only that, yes, nationally there's an issue, but actually right here in Lancashire and in Greater Manchester, there is a real issue. There's nothing else out there like this. They do dance workshops, which are delivered jointly by a learning disabled dancer and an able person. So that's lovely. But there's nothing like this. There's a real need here. People are saying that this is the benefits that our workshops have given them. And these are real life case studies. Now that's much more powerful than just relying on the statistics alone. So I think funders are also looking for the fact that also they're wise to this as well. You know, there are some professional bid writers out there that will just, trawl the statistics time and time again. It gives them no feeling that the organisations understands their audience. So I think they really want you to bring it to life and show that you really have gone out there. And there are different ways of doing that. I've been working with a small organisation, and that used Twitter polls.
Okay.
As its consultations. Yeah, because they're an online, they provide their support online, so it's a little bit more difficult for them to go out and consult their service users, and a lot of it's anonymous because of what they do as well, so that makes it a little bit more difficult. So they did Twitter polls, and one of the things that the funder commented upon was it was an innovative and new way to actually consult their service users.
Definitely. Yeah, and also having done all that consultation, it probably brings up another 10 services that you could perhaps develop as well. So it's really valuable information anyway.
Well, funnily enough, they've got a new project starting in the next 3 months. It came specifically out of there. I think it's also really good to refresh your thinking, because one of the areas that they felt that was needed, my organisation that does anonymous support, was not needed anymore. People said that's no longer a problem. Yet all the statistics still show it is.
Yeah. One also what I've found is organisations, like you say, when they want to test an idea, they're usually quite successful at getting the funding. When they've tested that idea and they're ready to take it to the next stage, they're not necessarily so successful in terms of then getting funding for continuation of that, because it is obviously keeping them dependent on funding. What if you've got a service user group that will never be able to afford to pay for that service? How could you successfully get funding to continue that work? What kind of things would you need to put in your application to make it stand out and be able to be funded?
I think part of it is explaining why that situation is the situation, but I think it's also thinking outside the box. So you might think that, my disability organisation, their service users find it difficult to actually fund their workshops, for example, because it is difficult. They pay a small contribution, but they would never fund it to its entirety. However, because we're determined we're not going to be dependent on funding moving forward, there's a number of different things. One is merchandise. They find that they do a lot of community taster events when they go out to community fetes and festivals and demonstrate what they do. People in the moment, it's an emotional purchase. They're quite happy to purchase a water bottle or a hoodie with their logo on and whatever else, So they've generated one income stream through that. A second income stream that they've generated is that they're now training others to be dance leaders. So they're charging for that training. So again, that's creating an income stream for them too. And performances. They can charge ticket prices for performances, so they do. So they're creating a whole different set of income streams that aren't dependent upon their actual end user. The other thing that I've encouraged them to do recently as well, which has proved successful, is to think about where the businesses can make a contribution to them. And the contribution isn't necessarily just financial. So for example, they now have office accommodation that's provided by a business. So they're no longer paying for their office accommodation or their telephone, because it's all provided by a local business that was very happy to support them in that way. So it doesn't necessarily even need to be money. It's hard to ask a business for money, but asking them for resources. They have, their accountant donates their time. I shouldn't be talking to you about that, actually.
Yeah. I've not got my accountancy business anymore, so you're allowed to say that. Otherwise, I'd be like, what? Yeah.
But I think there are different ways to think about it. You're always thinking about cost as well as income, and how can you do that? I work with a community centre in a very, very deprived area, and their model is a mix of funding and trading. And one of the things that we put in there a couple of years ago that's been hugely successful was we created a nursery, a children's nursery in the community centre. It's run as a separate social enterprise, but of course its income is generated to support the running of the community centre. So again, rather than thinking it's so hard to charge our service users on one of the most deprived estates in the UK for using our community centre, instead they thought, you know what, they've got children. There's no nurseries on the estate. There are free nursery places funded by the government. We could set up a nursery, and that's exactly what they've done. Now that's what I call forward and innovative thinking. And that's the same in the community centre. So I think there's lots of different ways of doing it.
Because there is always that question about, well, what's going to happen at the end of your project, or how are you going to continue this when the funding runs out? So having those kinds of income streams that perhaps don't necessarily completely fund the entire project, but perhaps fund a proportion of it, shows that you're actually thinking about those things and doing something proactive, rather than just kind of sitting there and saying, well, we'll wait till 2.5 years into our 3 years of funding and then reapply for something.
Absolutely. You know, my psychology company has a mix of contract work. So they go out and win contract work. They have some work that they win directly with, for example, schools, funded by the schools themselves. They have some that's funded by philanthropists. So they've gone for funding for their cultural consultants, which is an initiative in the community around mental health. So they've got a mix of different things going on. They have no problem getting funding for the bits that they cannot actually generate an income from themselves, because people look at it and go, but you're already generating this much income and your profit from that is already going back into that, therefore it's match funded, which is the other thing. The profit from their trading activities goes on their application forms as match funding. Funders love match funding. Yeah. It shows that they're not taking all the risk.
So in terms of your top 3 tips around funding and going for contracts, what would your top 3 tips be to someone that's about to start doing this kind of thing?
It's a very good question. 3 top tips. 1, make sure you've got your evidence. So make sure that you know, if you're going for a contract, what you've previously delivered and what the outcomes of that have been, so that you can say, I've worked with this number of service users and I've provided this number of hour support, or whatever it is, and these were the outcomes delivered. So that's number 1, prove it. I always do my so what test, prove it to me. And that applies equally for your funding bids, because again, all the funders want to know is prove it. Show me the evidence of need, show me the evidence of delivery. So evidence definitely number 1. The second thing for me is reach out and get the help you need. Lots of people lose tenders or don't win funding because quite simply they just didn't know how to actually answer the questions in the way in which the funder or the commissioner wanted. So reach out and get that help. It's a really, really worthwhile investment in doing it. Otherwise, if you think about it, you spend all that time and you didn't stand a chance because you didn't actually answer the questions right. So, that's it. And the third one for me as well is time. We're all busy. We all have a day job. We all have things that we have to do. But if you're serious about winning a public sector contract, or you're serious about winning funding, you need to put enough time to actually showcasing what you do properly. Without that, you're going to struggle. And it's no good leaving it to the last minute, as many people do, because you're just never going to make it, in that respect. So I would say all 3 of those would probably, I could give you lots, but we'll stick with 3 in the interest of time.
Yeah, if we want your other 7, we'll come back to you. I'm sure there's lots. I think there's lots of information in what you've shared with us today, Melanie. It's been really helpful in terms of obviously after today, if people do want to get in touch with Melanie, her details will be shared below the video, so you'll be able to get in touch with Melanie. But she does loads and loads of this type of work. So she is one of the top, and in fact probably the top expert in the country. I don't know about internationally, but she's multi-award winning for all of her work, as well as she mentioned. So definitely someone to think about if you need help in this area. And I really am so very grateful that you joined me today for this interview, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to doing it again sometime in the future.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. I've loved every minute of it. And as I say, one more message, just remember 59% of all contracts are won by people like us.
Yeah, definitely. That's
59% by value. Don't let anyone tell you that we can't win them, because it's just not true.
Yeah, that's, for me, I think that's one of the big statistics to take away from this interview, because obviously my question was, as a small organisation, will you ever stand a chance? And actually we've got the majority likelihood of winning those contracts. So definitely something to really think about and look for those contracts going forwards. Maybe I'll even put in for some contracts going forward. Rather than just trading all the time.
Well, you know where I am if you need some help.
Yes, definitely. All right, well, thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you today. Thank you.
And you too. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.